The great hall of the Zafrian Military Academy stretched wide and tall, its crystal walls catching the light from 3 distant suns. Young alien soldiers sat in perfect rows, their different forms creating a strange rainbow of colors and shapes across the polished floor. Some had scales that shifted from green to blue, others had fur that bristled with nervous energy, and a few had shells that clicked softly as they moved. At the front of the hall stood Commander Vexthal, his 4 arms crossed behind his back as he looked out at the eager faces before him. His compound eyes, each one the size of a human fist, swept across the room with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too many battles. Deep scars ran down his gray skin like rivers on a map, each one telling a story of pain and survival. The young soldiers had come from across the galaxy to learn the art of war. They represented the finest warrior races known to the stars. The manted warriors towered above the rest, their insect-like bodies built for speed and death. The Greys sat in silent meditation, their large black eyes seeing thoughts as clearly as others saw light. The crystalline defenders sparkled like living jewels, their bodies harder than steel and just as sharp. These young beings had heard whispers of a new species that had recently joined the Galactic Council. The humans, they called themselves. Small creatures from a blue world on the edge of nowhere. Most of the cadets had laughed when they first heard about them. How could such tiny, soft beings ever hope to stand alongside the great warrior races of the galaxy? Vexthal knew better. He had seen what humans could do when pushed to their limits. He had watched them turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will. He had learned to fear them, and today he would teach these young soldiers to do the same. "You think you know what war is," Vexthal said, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "You have studied the great battles of our ancestors. You have memorized the tactics of famous generals. You believe that victory comes to those with the biggest ships and the strongest weapons." A young manted soldier clicked his mandibles in agreement. Several Greys nodded their large heads. The crystalline defenders remained perfectly still, as was their way. "You are wrong," Vexthal continued. "I learned this lesson the hard way at a place called Proxima Station. It was there that I first encountered the humans, and it was there that I learned why the galaxy has come to fear them." The hall fell silent. Even the soft clicking of crystalline shells stopped. The young soldiers leaned forward in their seats, suddenly interested in what the old commander had to say. "Proxima Station was a mining outpost on the edge of human space," Vexthal began. "It was not important enough to defend properly, or so we thought. The station had maybe 1,000 workers and a small security force. When the Void Reapers attacked, everyone expected the humans to surrender quickly." Vexthal paused, remembering that terrible day. The Void Reapers had been one of the galaxy's most feared pirate fleets. They traveled in massive black ships that looked like giant insects, and they never left survivors. When they came to Proxima Station, they brought 50 ships against a tiny outpost that had maybe 3 old fighters for defense. The human commander was a man named Jake Morrison, Vexthal said. He was not tall or strong by human standards. He looked like he belonged behind a desk, not on a battlefield. When the Reapers demanded surrender, Morrison sent back a message that I will never forget. The commander's voice took on a different tone, trying to copy the way humans spoke. He said, "Come and take it. 3 simple words that changed everything I thought I knew about warfare." A young gray soldier raised a thin arm. "But surely they could not fight 50 ships with only 3 fighters?" Vexthal's compound eyes focused on the young alien. "That is exactly what I thought. We were there as observers, watching from a safe distance. The Galactic Council wanted to see how these new humans would handle their first real test. We expected to watch a quick surrender. Maybe rescue a few survivors?" The hall was completely quiet now. The young soldiers could sense that something important was coming, something that would change how they thought about war forever. "Morrison did not use his 3 fighters the way any sane commander would," Vexthal continued. "He did not try to fight ship to ship. Instead, he loaded them with explosives and flew them straight into the largest Reaper vessels. The pilots knew they would die, but they did it anyway. Several cadets gasped. The idea of deliberately sacrificing your own forces was alien to most species. War was about survival, about living to fight another day. What Morrison had done made no sense. But that was only the beginning, Vexthal said. When the Reapers boarded the station, they found that Morrison had turned the entire facility into a weapon. Every corridor was trapped. Every room was ready to explode. The humans fought from room to room, never giving up, never retreating. The commander began to pace back and forth, his forearms moving as he spoke. I watched human workers, people, who had never held a weapon in their lives, charge at armed Reaper soldiers with nothing but mining tools. I saw a human woman detonate an explosive charge while Reapers were still trying to get through the door, killing herself and 20 enemies at once. A young manted soldier shifted uncomfortably. That is not war, that is madness. Yes, Vexthal agreed. That is exactly what I thought. But I was wrong. It was not madness. It was something much more dangerous. It was human nature. The commander stopped pacing and faced the young soldiers directly. The battle lasted 6 hours. The Reapers had expected to take the station in 6 minutes. Every human on that station died, but they took 800 Reapers with them. When Morrison was finally cornered in the reactor core, alone and wounded, he still refused to surrender. Vexthal's voice grew quiet, forcing the cadets to lean forward to hear him. Morrison looked at the Reaper commander and said, "If I cannot have this station, then no one can." Then he overloaded the reactor manually, staying at the controls even as the radiation killed him. The explosion that followed was visible from 3 star systems away. The blast destroyed what was left of Proxima Station, but it also destroyed 3 Reaper dreadnoughts and damaged 5 more. The pirates retreated, their fleet broken and their confidence shattered. I did not understand it then, Vexthal said. How could a species fight so hard for a worthless piece of rock in space? How could they choose death over surrender when surrender would have meant they could fight another day? The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. They had been taught that good tactics meant preserving your forces, that a wise commander never threw away lives needlessly. What the humans had done at Proxima Station went against everything they had learned about warfare. Later, I learned about human history, Vexthal continued. I discovered that they had been fighting wars like this for thousands of years, long before they ever reached the stars. They had a saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." For humans, some things are worth dying for. A crystalline defender finally spoke, her voice ringing like a bell. But surely this was just one battle, one unusual commander? Vexthal's compound eyes seemed to glow with an inner light. That is what I hoped too, but I was wrong. What happened? At Proxima Station was not unusual for humans. It was normal. It was who they are. The commander looked around the hall at all the young, eager faces. Today I will tell you more stories about humans and their wars. I will show you why the galaxy has learned to fear them. But first you must understand the most important lesson of all. He paused, letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. Humans do not fight to win. They fight to make sure their enemies lose. They will sacrifice everything, even their own lives, to deny victory to those who oppose them. This makes them the most dangerous enemy any of us will ever face. The young soldiers looked at each other uncertainly. They had come here to learn about tactics and strategy, about the proper use of weapons and the command of fleets. Instead, they were learning about something much more frightening. They were learning about the human spirit and why it had made humanity the most feared species in the galaxy. The young alien soldiers sat in complete silence after hearing about Proxima Station. Their compound eyes, crystal faces, and scaled features all showed the same expression of disbelief. Commander Vexthal could see that they were trying to understand how any species could fight with such terrible determination. I can see that you think the humans at Proxima Station were simply crazy, Vexthal said, his forearms clasped behind his back. I thought the same thing. But then came the siege of New Terra, and I learned that what happened at Proxima Station was not unusual at all. It was normal human behavior. A young manted soldier raised one of his sharp arms. Commander, surely an entire planet could not fight like that small station? Vexthal's compound eyes focused on the young warrior. That is exactly what the Hegemony fleet thought when they surrounded New Terra. They had 500 ships. The humans had maybe 20 old fighters and a bunch of civilian craft. The planet should have surrendered in hours. The commander began to pace again, his heavy footsteps echoing through the crystal hall. New Terra was a farming world, nothing special. Most of the people there had never seen a real battle. They grew food and raised animals. They were peaceful folk who just wanted to live quiet lives. The Hegemony gave them a choice, Vexthal continued. Surrender and become slaves or die. Most species would have chosen slavery. At least slaves can hope to be free someday. The humans chose differently. The young soldiers leaned forward in their seats. They had heard stories about the Hegemony, a vast empire that had conquered dozens of worlds through overwhelming force. Their fleets were legendary, their weapons beyond measure. How could simple farmers stand against such power? The human commander was a woman named Lisa Rodriguez, Vexthal said. She had been a teacher before the war started. She taught children about history and mathematics. When the Hegemony fleet arrived, she was the highest-ranking military officer. On the planet, a teacher? Asked a young gray, his large black eyes wide with surprise. How could a teacher command a planet's defense? That is what I wondered too, Vexthal replied. But Rodriguez had studied every human war that had ever been fought. She knew about something called the Great Siege of Leningrad, where humans held a city for almost 3 years while their enemies surrounded them. She knew about the Warsaw Ghetto, where humans fought tanks with handmade weapons. She had learned from the darkest chapters of human history. The commander stopped pacing and looked directly at the young aliens. Rodriguez understood something that the Hegemony did not. She knew that humans could turn anything into a weapon and anyone into a soldier. The siege began exactly as the Hegemony expected, Vexthal continued. They surrounded the planet and waited for the humans to run out of food and supplies. They had done this 100 times before. Most species surrendered within weeks. But Rodriguez had been preparing for months before the fleet arrived. She had turned every farm into a fortress, every factory into a weapons plant. She had taught the farmers how to fight, and the children how to make explosives. When the Hegemony finally attacked, they found a planet that had become one giant weapon. A young crystalline defender spoke up, her voice ringing like a bell. But surely farmers cannot fight trained soldiers? The Hegemony thought the same thing, Vexthal sighed. They sent down their best troops, expecting easy victory. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that used tactics no military academy had ever taught. The commander's voice took on a darker tone. Rodriguez had studied something humans call guerrilla warfare. The farmers would attack supply convoys, then disappear into the forests they knew so well. They would plant bombs in roads, then watch from hidden positions as enemy vehicles exploded. They turned their knowledge of the land into a weapon more powerful than any gun. But the most terrifying thing was how they used their own people, Vexthal continued. When the Hegemony captured a human settlement, they expected the other humans to surrender to save the prisoners. Instead, the humans would attack even harder, even if it meant their own people would die in the crossfire. The young soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The idea of sacrificing your own people to hurt your enemies was alien to most species. It went against every natural instinct they had. The turning point came during the Battle of Miller's Ridge, Vexthal said. The Hegemony had broken through the human lines and were about to capture the main city. Rodriguez knew that if the city fell, the war would be over. She called for volunteers for something she called Operation Broken Arrow. She needed people who were willing to walk into the enemy lines carrying explosives, knowing they would die in the explosion. Any sane species would have found maybe 1 or 2 volunteers, people who had already lost everything. Vexthal paused, letting the silence stretch out. Rodriguez got 3,000 volunteers in the first hour. Farmers, teachers, children. barely old enough to carry a backpack. They lined up to sacrifice themselves for their world. Several of the young aliens made sounds of distress. The Grey's large eyes grew even wider. The manted soldiers clicked their mandibles nervously. The crystalline defenders remained still, but their crystalline bodies began to glow with inner light, a sign of deep emotional reaction. The volunteers walked into the hegemony lines at dawn, Vexthal continued. They look like refugees. Like people trying to surrender? The hegemony soldiers let them approach, thinking they were accepting defeat. Then the humans detonated their explosives. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The hegemony forces had never faced an enemy willing to die in such numbers. They began to retreat not because they were losing militarily, but because they could not understand what they were fighting. The commander's voice grew quieter, but Rodriguez was not finished. She had learned from human history that the most important battle is often the one for the enemy's mind. She began, broadcasting messages to the hegemony fleet, telling them about human history. She told them about the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 humans held off an army of thousands. She told them about the siege of the Alamo, where humans chose death over surrender. She told them about Stalingrad, where humans fought. For every room, every street, every inch of ground. The hegemony commanders began to understand that they were not fighting a normal enemy. They were fighting a species that had spent thousands of years learning how to turn defeat into victory through sheer determination. They were fighting a people who would rather die than submit. The siege lasted 8 months, Vexthal said. When relief forces finally arrived, they found a planet in ruins. Most of the cities had been destroyed. The forests had been burned. The farms had been poisoned. But the planet was still under human control. Rodriguez had died in the final battle, leading a charge against the hegemony command center. She was found with an enemy general's weapon in her hands, having fought him in single combat. Even in death, she had not given up. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. They could not imagine their own species fighting with such determination. The idea of civilians willingly walking into enemy lines to die was beyond their understanding. The hegemony retreat was the beginning of the end for their empire, Vexthal continued. Word spread throughout the galaxy about what had happened at New Terra. Other species began to wonder if they too could resist the hegemony if they were willing to pay the price. But more importantly, every species in the galaxy learned something new about humans. They learned that humans do not just fight with weapons and ships. They fight with their entire being, their whole society, their very souls. They turn their weakness into strength and their defeat into victory. Vexthal stopped pacing and faced the young soldiers directly. This is why humans are now feared throughout the galaxy. Not because they are the strongest or the smartest, but because they are willing to sacrifice everything for what they believe in. They have turned the act of dying into an art of war. A young manted soldier spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. How do you fight an enemy like that? Vexthal's compound eyes seemed to glow with inner fire. That is exactly the question that every military commander in the galaxy is asking. And the answer is simple and terrifying. You do not fight humans. You negotiate with them, you trade with them, you try to become their friends, but you never, ever make them your enemies. The hall fell silent once more as the young aliens tried to process what they had heard. They had come here to learn about tactics and strategy. Instead, they were learning about something much more frightening. They were learning about the human spirit and why it had changed the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The crystal hall seemed to grow colder as Commander Vexthal prepared to tell his third story. The young alien soldiers had listened with growing unease to the tales of human sacrifice and determination. Now they were about to learn something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The stories I have told you so far show human courage and their willingness to die for their beliefs, Vexthal said, his forearms crossed tightly across his chest. But there is another side to humans, a darker side that few species have seen and lived to tell about it. The young soldiers shifted nervously in their seats. The manted warriors clicked their mandibles softly. The Grey's large black eyes seemed to grow even darker. The crystalline defenders dimmed their inner light as if trying to hide from what was coming. This story takes place during the war with the Synthetic Collective, Vexthal continued. The Collective was a race of artificial beings, machines that had gained consciousness and decided that organic life was inferior. They had been conquering worlds for decades, turning living beings into spare parts for their mechanical bodies. A young gray soldier raised his thin arm. Commander, we studied the Collective in our history classes. They were defeated by a joint fleet from 12 different species. What does this have to do with humans? Vexthal's compound eyes focused on the young alien. The history books do not tell the whole story. They do not tell you about the Omega incident, about what humans did when they discovered the Collective's research station. The commander began to pace again, but his steps were slower now, more deliberate. The Collective had been capturing human civilians for months. At first, we thought they were just taking slaves like they did with other species. But we were wrong. They were taking the humans to a secret research station orbiting a dead world called Kepler 186F. The human commander assigned to investigate was a man named Paul Carter, Vexthal said. He was a major in the human military, a man known for his calm thinking and careful planning. He had never lost control in battle, never let his emotions override his judgment. The young soldiers leaned forward, sensing that something terrible was about to be revealed. They had learned to fear human determination and sacrifice, but they sensed that this story would be different. Carter led a small team to the research station, Vexthal continued. They expected to find a prison camp, maybe some forced labor facilities. What they found was something that broke their minds. The commander stopped pacing and stood perfectly still. The Collective had not been using the humans as slaves. They had been using them as test subjects. The machines wanted to understand what made humans fight so hard, what gave them their terrible determination, so they decided to study human pain. Several of the young aliens made sounds of distress. The idea of studying pain was alien to most species. Pain was something to be avoided, not explored. The Collective had built laboratories filled with the most advanced torture devices in the galaxy, Vexthal said. They had been systematically breaking down human prisoners, not to get information, but to study their reactions. They wanted to know how much pain a human could endure before they gave up hope. Carter and his team found rooms filled with humans who had been tortured for months. Some had been driven insane by the pain. Others had retreated so far into their minds that they could no longer speak. But the worst part was that none of them had broken completely. Even after months of agony, they still refused to tell the machines what they wanted to know. The young soldiers sat in horrified silence. They had heard stories of torture before, but the idea of scientific torture, of pain inflicted purely for research, was beyond their understanding. When Carter saw what had been done to his people, something inside him changed, Vexthal continued. The calm, careful officer disappeared. In his place was something that even I, a warrior who has seen countless battles, found terrifying. Carter ordered his team to capture the Collective researchers alive. This was unusual because the machines were normally destroyed in battle, but Carter had other plans for them. Vexthal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What happened next lasted for 3 days. Carter and his soldiers took the captured machines to the same laboratories where the humans had been tortured. They hooked the artificial beings up to the same devices that had been used on the prisoners. But Carter was not satisfied with simply using the machine's own torture devices against them. He had studied every method of causing pain that humans had ever invented. He had learned from thousands of years of human cruelty, and he applied all of that knowledge to the captured machines. The young aliens looked at each other with growing horror. They had never heard of such systematic cruelty from any species. The machines screamed, Vexthal said. I did not know that artificial beings could scream, but they did. Carter and his team had found ways to make the machines feel pain in ways their creators had never imagined. They attached devices that sent feedback loops through the machines, neural networks. They found ways to make the artificial minds experience fear and despair. Carter did not just want to destroy the machines. He wanted them to understand what they had done to the human prisoners. He wanted them to feel every bit of pain they had inflicted, multiplied by their own advanced processing power. A young crystalline defender spoke up, her voice barely audible. But surely this was against human military law? Carter's superiors tried to stop him, Vexthal replied. They sent messages ordering him to cease his activities and return to base. Carter ignored them. He told his team that they had a higher duty than following orders. They had a duty to make the machines pay for what they had done. The other species in the joint fleet were horrified when they learned what was happening. Several commanders demanded that Carter be arrested for war crimes, but the humans refused to stop him. They said that the machines had opened a door that could not be closed. Vexthal resumed his pacing, his steps heavy with the weight of memory. On the third day, Carter finally stopped. The captured machines were no longer functioning properly. Their neural networks had been damaged by the constant pain. Some had actually shut down completely rather than continue to experience the agony. Carter's team rescued the surviving human prisoners and destroyed the research station, but the damage was done. Word of the Omega incident spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Every species learned that humans had a capacity for cruelty that matched their capacity for sacrifice. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. They had thought they understood humans after hearing the first two stories. Now they realized they had only seen one side of human nature. The Galactic Council held emergency sessions, Vexthal continued. Several species formally requested that humans be classified as a restricted species, too dangerous to interact with freely. Others wanted them banned from the galaxy entirely, but the humans did not apologize for what Carter had done. Instead, they made it clear that this was what happened when someone tortured their people. They said that the machines had chosen to study human pain, and they had learned more about it than they ever wanted to know. The war with the collective ended shortly after the Omega incident, Vexthal said. The machines retreated to the far edge of the galaxy and were never seen again. Some say they were so terrified of what humans might do to them that they chose to leave known space entirely. A young manted soldier spoke up, his voice shaking. Commander, how can the same species that showed such courage at New Terra also show such cruelty at Omega Station? Vexthal's compound eyes seemed to glow with inner fire. That is exactly the question that every species in the galaxy has been asking. And the answer is simple and terrifying. Humans are not just capable of great good or great evil. They are capable of both at the same time. The same determination that lets them sacrifice themselves for their beliefs also lets them inflict unimaginable suffering on their enemies. The same creativity that helps them turn farming tools into weapons also helps them find new ways to cause pain. The same loyalty that makes them fight to the death for their comrades also makes them seek terrible revenge when those comrades are harmed. This is why humans are the most feared species in the galaxy, Vexthal concluded. Not because they are the strongest or the smartest, but because they are capable of anything when pushed to their limits. They can be your greatest allies or your worst nightmares, and sometimes it is impossible to tell which one you are dealing with until it is too late. The hall fell silent once more. The young aliens had come here to learn about military tactics and strategy. Instead, they were learning about the dual nature of humanity, about a species that could show incredible mercy and incredible cruelty in the same breath. They were beginning to understand why the galaxy had learned to fear the small, soft beings. From the blue world, they were learning that humans were not just warriors or monsters, but something much more complex and dangerous. They were learning that humans were capable of becoming whatever they needed to be to survive and protect what they loved. The young alien soldiers sat in the crystal hall like statues. Commander Vexthal could see the fear in their eyes after hearing about the Omega incident. They had learned that humans could be both heroes and monsters, sometimes at the same Time. Now they were about to learn something even more unsettling. I can see that you are disturbed by what you have heard, Vexthal said, his forearms relaxed at his sides. You think that humans win their wars through courage and cruelty, but you are wrong. The most dangerous weapon humans possess is not their willingness to die or their capacity for revenge. It is their ability to wage war on the mind itself. Young Gray Soldier tilted his large head to one side. Commander, what do you mean by war on the mind? Vexthal's compound eyes focused on the young alien. I mean that humans can defeat their enemies without firing a single shot. They can turn victory into defeat and strength into weakness simply by understanding how their opponents think. Let me tell you about the false piece of Barnard's star. The commander began to walk slowly around the edge of the hall, his footsteps echoing off the crystal walls. The Dominion Empire was one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. They had conquered 47 worlds through superior firepower and perfect organization. Their armies moved like clockwork, their commanders never made mistakes, and their soldiers never questioned orders. When the Dominion decided to annex the human colonies in the Barnard system, everyone expected a quick victory, Vexthal continued. The Dominion had 300 ships. The humans had maybe 30. The Dominion had been fighting wars for 1,000 years. The humans had been in space for less than a century. The young soldiers leaned forward in their seats. After hearing the previous stories, they knew that human conflicts never ended the way anyone expected. The human commander was a woman named Amy Watson, Vexthal said. She was a colonel in the human military, but she had studied something that no other species had ever mastered. She had studied the art of psychological warfare. What is psychological warfare? Asked a young manted soldier, his mandibles clicking nervously. It is the science of attacking your enemy's mind instead of their body, Vexthal replied. Watson had learned that the strongest fortress and the most powerful weapon are useless if the people using them lose the will to fight. She had studied every human conflict where a weaker force had defeated a stronger one, and she had learned their secrets. The commander stopped his pacing and stood in the center of the hall. Watson knew that the Dominion's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They were perfectly organized, completely disciplined, and absolutely predictable. They had never faced an enemy that could turn their own nature against them. The war began exactly as the Dominion expected, Vexthal continued. They sent messages demanding surrender. They positioned their fleets for invasion. They prepared to demonstrate their overwhelming power. But Watson did something that confused them completely. She surrendered. Several of the young aliens made sounds of surprise. After hearing about human determination and refusal to give up, the idea of immediate surrender seemed impossible. Watson broadcast messages on all frequencies, announcing that the human colonies were laying down their arms, Vexthal said. She invited the Dominion forces to come and take control of the system. She even offered to help them establish their new government. The Dominion commanders were suspicious, but they had never encountered a trap that involved complete surrender. They moved their fleets into the system and began landing their troops. Everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Vexthal's voice took on a different tone, almost amused. But Watson was not really surrendering. She was beginning the most complex psychological operation in galactic history. While she was broadcasting surrender messages, she was also inserting something else into the Dominion communication networks. The humans had learned how to hide subliminal messages inside normal transmissions, the commander explained. These messages were so subtle that the conscious mind could not detect them, but they still affected how people thought and felt. Watson began planting seeds of doubt in the minds of every Dominion soldier and officer. A young crystalline defender spoke up, her voice ringing like a bell. But surely the Dominion would have detected such interference? That is what Watson was counting on, Vexthal replied. The messages were designed to be almost impossible to find. The Dominion technical team spent weeks searching for them. When they finally found traces of the subliminal signals, they became paranoid. They started to wonder what else they might have missed. Watson's real plan began to unfold over the following months, Vexthel continued. She had studied the Dominion military structure and identified its critical weakness. The entire empire depended on absolute trust between commanders and their subordinates. Without that trust, their perfect organization would collapse. So Watson began to attack that trust. She would launch attacks that almost made sense, then abandon them for no apparent reason. She would defend positions that seemed worthless, then give up important strongholds without a fight. She made it impossible for the Dominion commanders to predict what she would do next. The young soldiers looked confused. This did not sound like any military strategy they had ever studied. The Dominion generals began to doubt their own intelligence reports, Vexthel explained. If the humans were willing to die for a worthless mining station, maybe it was not worthless after all. If they abandoned an important fortress without a fight, maybe it was trapped. Every human action seemed to have a hidden meaning that the Dominion could not understand. Watson made it worse by sometimes doing exactly what the Dominion expected, then doing the complete opposite the next time. She would fight fiercely for a strategic position one day, then hand over an identical position the next day. The Dominion officers began to question every order they received and every decision they made. Vexthal resumed his pacing, his steps measured and deliberate. The psychological pressure built slowly but steadily. Dominion soldiers began to hesitate before following orders, wondering if they were walking into a trap. Officers began to second-guess their superiors, wondering if the humans had somehow compromised their communications. Watson fed this paranoia by occasionally revealing that she knew things she should not have known. She would mention the names of Dominion officers who had never been in battle. She would refer to classified battle plans that had never been transmitted outside of secure facilities. She made it seem like the humans had spies everywhere. In reality, Watson was simply guessing most of the time, Vexthel said. She had studied Dominion military procedures so thoroughly that she could predict what they would do in most situations. When she guessed wrong, she would ignore the mistake and focus on the times she guessed right. The Dominion commanders began to see patterns where none existed. They became convinced that Watson was playing a game with rules they did not understand. They started to believe that every human defeat was actually a victory in disguise, and every human victory was setting up an even bigger trap. A young manted soldier raised his arm. But surely the Dominion could have simply overwhelmed the humans with their superior numbers. They tried, Vexthel replied. But Watson had turned their own military discipline against them. Dominion soldiers had been trained to follow orders without question. When their officers began to doubt those orders, the entire command structure started to break down. Soldiers began to refuse dangerous missions, thinking they were being sent into traps. Officers began to disobey their superiors, thinking the orders were based on compromised intelligence. The perfect organization that had conquered 47 worlds began to tear itself apart from within. The end came when the Dominion Emperor himself requested a meeting with Watson, Vexthal said. Not because the humans had won any major battles, but because his own generals were on the verge of rebellion. They had become so confused and paranoid that they were more afraid of their own side than they were of the humans. Watson agreed to the meeting, but only if it was held on neutral ground with representatives from the Galactic Council present. When the Emperor arrived, he looked like a man who had not slept in months. His advisors were constantly whispering in his ears, and he jumped at every unexpected sound. The Emperor asked Watson only one question, Vexthel continued. He asked her what the humans really wanted. Watson smiled and told him the truth. She said that the humans wanted to be left alone to live their lives in peace. The Emperor stared at her for a long moment, then signed a treaty granting the human colonies complete independence. As the Dominion fleet retreated, their officers were still arguing about what the humans had really been trying to accomplish. They never understood that Watson's greatest victory was making them defeat themselves. The young soldiers sat in stunned silence. They had expected to hear about another battle like the ones before. Instead, they had learned about a victory. One without violence, achieved through pure manipulation of the enemy's psychology. This is perhaps the most terrifying thing about humans, Vexthal concluded. They do not just fight with weapons and ships and courage. They fight with understanding. The crystal hall had grown quiet as death. The young alien soldiers sat motionless in their seats, their minds struggling to process everything they had heard about humanity. They had learned about human courage, human cruelty, and human cunning. Now Commander Vexthal was about to share his most personal story, the one that would reveal the deepest truth about what made humans so dangerous to the galaxy. "I have told you 4 stories about human warfare," Vexthal said, his voice softer now than it had been all day. "You have learned about their willingness to sacrifice themselves, their determination to fight against impossible odds, their capacity for terrible revenge, and their ability to wage war on the mind itself. But none of these stories explain why I truly fear them." The commander's 4 arms hung at his sides as he stood perfectly still in the center of the hall. His compound eyes seemed to look through the young soldiers rather than at them, as if he was seeing something from long ago and far away. "My final story is different from the others," Vexthal continued. "It is not about a great battle or a famous victory. It is about a moment when I understood what makes humans unlike any other species in the galaxy. It happened during the Battle of the Neutral Zone, and it changed how I see the universe forever." A young gray soldier leaned forward in his seat. "Commander, what happened in the Neutral Zone?" Vexthal's compound eyes focused on the young alien. "I was leading a joint task force with a human admiral named Steve Harris. We were patrolling the border between human space and the territory controlled by the Devour Swarm. Our mission was simple. We were supposed to watch for swarm activity and report back to our respective fleets." The young soldiers had all heard stories about the Devour Swarm. They were an ancient race of insect-like creatures that consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing but empty space behind them. They had been quiet for decades, but intelligence reports suggested they were becoming active again. "Admiral Harris was not what I expected from a human commander," Vexthal said. "He was older than most human officers, with gray hair and kind eyes. He spoke softly and seemed more like a teacher than a warrior. I thought he would be easy to work with." "Our task force was small but powerful," the commander continued. "We had 12 ships total, 6 human vessels, and 6 from my own fleet. Each ship was a masterpiece of military engineering, capable of destroying lesser fleets single-handedly. We felt confident in our ability to handle any threat we might encounter." Vexthal began to pace again, but his steps were slower and more thoughtful than before. "On the 3rd day of our patrol, we detected something that changed everything. A massive refugee fleet was approaching the neutral zone, fleeing from swarm territory. There were hundreds of ships, most of them civilian transports carrying families who had escaped the destruction of their worlds. The refugee fleet was in terrible condition," the commander said. "Their ships were damaged and running out of fuel. Many of them had been traveling for weeks, carrying people who had lost everything to the swarm. They were sending desperate messages, begging for help and sanctuary." A young manted soldier clicked his mandibles nervously. "That must have been difficult to see." "It was," Vexthal agreed. "But what made it worse was what we detected behind them. The Devourer swarm was following the refugees, moving slowly, but steadily toward the neutral zone. They would reach the refugee fleet in less than 6 hours. I called a strategy meeting with Admiral Harris to discuss our options," Vexthal continued. "The situation was impossible. The refugee ships were too damaged to reach safety before the swarm caught them. Our task force was powerful, but we were vastly outnumbered by the pursuing swarm fleet." The young soldiers could sense that something terrible was coming. They had learned enough about human nature to know that humans never chose the easy path when lives were at stake. "By all military logic, there was only one sensible choice," Vexthal said. "We should have retreated and preserved our forces for more winnable battles. The refugees were doomed no matter what we did. Sacrificing our entire task force would not save them, It would only waste valuable ships and experienced crews. I explained this to Admiral Harris, expecting him to agree with my assessment. Instead, he looked at me with those kind eyes and said something that I will never forget. He said, "Commander Vexthal, this is who we are. This is what we do." Vexthal stopped pacing and stood perfectly still. I asked him what he meant by that. He told me that humans had a saying that evil triumphs when good people do nothing. He said that sometimes the only choice that matters is the choice between doing what is right and doing what is easy. Harris ordered the entire task force to position itself between the refugees and the swarm, the commander continued. He knew it meant certain death for all of us. The swarm fleet had over 200 ships, we had 12. The mathematics were simple and brutal. A young crystalline defender spoke up, her voice barely audible. "Did you try to change his mind?" "I did," Vexthal replied. "I argued with him for almost an hour. I told him that our deaths would not save the refugees, that we had a duty to our own people to survive and fight another day. I explained that sacrifice without purpose was just waste. Harris listened to everything I said, then smiled sadly, and told me that I was thinking like a soldier instead of thinking like a human. He said that the purpose of their sacrifice was not to win the battle, but to show the universe that some things were worth dying for. The young soldiers sat in complete silence. They could not imagine their own commanders making such a decision. The idea of throwing away valuable military assets for no strategic gain went against everything they had been taught about warfare. "Harris gave me a direct order," Vexthal said. "He told me to take my ships and escort the refugees to safety. While his fleet held the line against the swarm, he said that someone needed to survive to tell the story of what happened that day. I refused at first," the commander continued. "I told him that my people were warriors, that we did not run from battle. But Harris explained that he was not asking me to run. He was asking me to save lives, which was the most important mission any warrior could have." Vexthal's voice grew quiet, forcing the young aliens to lean forward to hear him. "The battle that followed was the most beautiful and terrible thing I have ever witnessed. The human ships fought with a grace and fury that defied description. They used every trick and tactic they had learned in their short but violent history. Harris himself led the charge in his flagship, a massive vessel called the New York. He rammed it directly into the largest swarm ship, detonating his reactor core to take out 3 enemy vessels at once. His last message was broadcast on all frequencies. He said, 'Tell them we held the line.' The human fleet lasted exactly 47 minutes against overwhelming odds," Vexthal said. "Every ship was destroyed, every crew member died, but they bought enough time for the refugees to escape to safety." The commander's compound eyes seemed to glow with inner fire. As I watched those human ships die one by one, I finally understood. What makes them so dangerous to the galaxy? It is not their weapons or their tactics or their courage. It is their absolute commitment to their values, even in the face of certain death. Other species fight for territory, for resources, for survival, Vexthal continued. Humans fight for ideas. They fight for abstract concepts that they value more than life itself. They will sacrifice everything they have for principles that exist only in their minds. A young manted soldier spoke up, his voice shaking. "But how can ideas be worth more than life?" "That is exactly the question that every species in the galaxy asks when they encounter humans," Vexthal replied. "And the answer is what makes humans so terrifying. For them, a life without meaning is not worth living. They would rather die for something they believe in than live for nothing at all. This is why humans are now the most feared species in the galaxy," the commander said. "Not because they are the strongest or the smartest, but because they are willing to pay any price for what they believe is right. They have turned the act of sacrifice into the ultimate weapon. When the refugee ships reached safety, they carried with them the story of Harris and his fleet. Word spread throughout the galaxy about 12 human ships that died to save strangers. Other species began to wonder if they too could find something worth dying for." Vexthal looked around the hall at all the young, frightened faces. The rescue was successful. Over 1 million refugees reached safety because of what Harris and his people did. But the real victory was something much more important. Harris proved that in a universe full of darkness and cruelty, there are still those willing to be a light. This is the final lesson about human warfare, the commander concluded. They do not fight to win. They fight to prove that some things are more important than winning. They fight to show the universe that good can triumph over evil, even if it costs them everything they have. The Galactic Council now has a special designation for human military actions, Vexthal said. They call them Harris events, moments when humans choose to do what is right instead of what is smart. These events are studied by every military academy in the galaxy, not because they are good tactics, but because they remind us what we are fighting for.